I also want you to think about the long-term implications of World War II, and part of what we're doing is talking about the Cold War um, as one of those implications, and even into the 60s and beyond. So I wanted you to have a little more time to kind of play with that. What I want to do today is to pick up and talk about the Cold War some more, kind of get into the second part of that discussion. Last time we discussed the early Cold War. I wanted to change the timeline a bit, right? I wanted you to think about not just 1945 as the beginning, but really how things are already in place, the 30s and earlier. And so we talked a lot about the earlier period, although we did get up to the end of the war and into the early 50s. I want to do some more of that today and kind of bring it up a little further, see how things develop. Remember some of the main themes that we were talking about, and so some of the terms are still valid, the specific ones down here at the bottom, but also these kind of major concepts, these overall approaches. Be thinking about the American dream and what it looks like for people, and how for many, fear, right? The American dream is under attack from their perspective, and so a lot of the things we see develop on the home front come from that place, right? A place of fear, tension, anxiety, not even getting into whether it's valid or invalid, right? Once fear is there, fear has an impact. We saw this with Reconstruction. We saw it with the Great Depression. We saw it with World War I, right? Fear is a major motivator, and often we do things either logically or illogically or both, right, based on fear. Fear is tremendous in the Cold War, right? Tremendous, and I think it's so long term, so long lasting that sometimes we forget that, right? Sometimes, unless you see the images of people building concrete bomb shelters, right? People storing canned food, expecting an attack, gas masks, right? Unless you see those things, unless you see the bomb duck and cover drills in elementary schools, like I was talking about before, kind of tend to forget the amount of fear. But even, I would say, just on a daily basis, you saw it in popular culture. I mean, well into, when I was a young person in the 80s, a lot of the films, right, the bad guys in the films were always the Russians, because that was our focus. That was our sort of motivator in that sense, despite the fact that, of course, millions of Russian immigrants have come here and become Americans. The idea of Russia itself is tremendously scary. So we want to keep this in mind. The Cold War is kind of an umbrella term for a 40 or 50-year period at least. And everything seemed to develop in relation to the Cold War. Even as we'll see when we get into the 60s, when we get into civil rights and feminism, those movements are interpreted in terms of the Cold War. So we'll begin to talk about that maybe a little bit today, and get into that next week and thinking about the 60s. So I want to jump back into where we left off and use some of the terms to do so, and think big picture, think small picture, be thinking about World War II and its implications all at the same time. So the Cold War and the sort of spread of communism in Eastern Europe in particular is going to have effects here on the home front. Right? It's not just about these things happening in Eastern Europe or in China. The war in Korea in the 50s, of course, is again going to make us think about connections between the battlefield and the home front. A war that we don't win, right? So it's one of these first losses, I guess, on an international theater, which makes us rethink a lot of things. Maybe makes us questioning the American dream. Maybe makes us question the future in certain ways. That has long-term implications as well. If we think about the late 40s and the 50s, it's a period of tremendous anxiety, and we're going to try to see how does that manifest itself here at home. One of the things it causes us to do is tremendously increase defense spending, right? To tremendously increase defense spending. Our ideas about, and this is a lingering idea we've been discussing, what is the role of government? Right? Notions of big government versus small government and spending, and what that entails goes through tremendous transformations, right? It's the tremendous tipping point for that question in this period. We're going to spend way more in the Cold War than we spend in World War II or World War I or any of those conflicts, right? Because it almost becomes a continuous idea of warfare, not just 4 years of World War II, but 40 years, 50 years, and different types of weapons, as we'll see. So Defense spending, right? Defense spending is kind of the thing, the watchword. But what are the impacts of that? Is it possible to spend billions and even trillions on defense and still take care of home? Some say no, but others say, well, if you don't spend this on defense, there will be no home to take care of. Think about a question like this again in a 2021 context or 2000 whenever context, right? What about a war on terror? Keeping the border safe, right? How do those questions affect, say, roads or schools or civil services, right? These are always difficult questions, and it's not the first time we've had to answer them in this way. So think about this idea of defense spending. As more and more companies start to rely on defense contracts, you start to get this marriage between civilian life and military life. Some think that might be dangerous. Our tradition is that our president is not a military figure, right? Even those generals, like an Eisenhower, for instance, who make their name in the military, essentially are civilian leaders when they become president, right? As Mr. President, not General President. And that's intentional, in part because studying history, a fear of coups and military takeovers and such, right? Studying our own history, the fact that we emerged from being a colony, right? And we felt like military occupation by the British. We've always been very concerned about that. There are reasons we have the smallest military of any superpower. Right? So that kind of marriage or that close relationship, let's say, between civilian life and military life is something that we still try to figure out, sometimes redefine. So more and more companies start to rely on defense contracts. Some say then the power of what's going to be called the military-industrial complex starts to grow. Military-industrial complex. We'll get back to that. We'll define it here in a minute. One domestic result of this is, again, this relationship between civilian and military life. But it also comes with a wave of economic prosperity. Remember, World War II ends the Great Depression, and so there's a lot more money flowing. We're pumping it back into the economy. The economy is churning out products like never before. And all of this is happening at the same time. You get the growth of a middle class. Part of some of your projects are dealing with the growth of this middle class through these returning soldiers who suddenly have access to college education in a way that their predecessors did not. Right? Have access to white-collar jobs, perhaps. The middle class grows more than ever before in this period of TIPS. So the World War II era has lingering changes and identifiable changes. So we want to look at all of these things. We want to look at our shift in American foreign policy, right, where we become more and more involved in the rest of the world, not isolationist anymore. Isolationism is not the watchword any longer. And what's going to be the effect of that? How does that change the American dream in certain ways? So a couple of questions to keep in mind. Think about how American leaders would think about the threat abroad and the threat here at home. Right? How are they going to handle this? The perceived threat of communist aggression. Especially in the 1950s when it reaches a high point, it seems, in the 50s and early 60s. What does this mean about the American dream in the 50s and 60s? A lot of our questions, I think, will try to answer that question. We start to see movement. Migration patterns are still in effect. As we mentioned, World War II, you see even more migration than you saw in World War I, right? Defense industry, in particular, a place like California, right? Huge defense industry here. My stepfather used to work for General Dynamics here in San Diego. Right? Coming out of this, Boeing and other companies on the West Coast lead to a transformation of the West Coast and the nation at large. What's the role of our economy? Capitalism itself. Remember, Marx thought that capitalism kind of contained the seeds of its own destruction. Marx believed that capitalism oppressed workers. Workers eventually figure that out, and it leads to revolution. But in this era, we're going to really challenge that, recast that, and some will argue that capitalism is the equal of freedom. That capitalism is the vehicle for freedom. for individuals, and that communism is the oppressive force, and that we have to use our economy to defeat their economy. Right? We have to use our ideology to defeat their ideology. The Cold War really is a battle of ideologies, a battle of worldviews and perspectives, two different visions of how the world and how it should develop. So we'll try to look at those things. We talked a lot about Truman last time. Remember, Truman comes into office with the death of FDR, and he really starts to set the stage in terms of the Cold War. His policies are going to be early policies that will set the stage moving forward. The Truman Doctrine, we mentioned the Truman Doctrine last time, which he lays out in 1947. Think about how that doctrine, once it's out there, is going to impact decisions around the world when events like the Berlin crisis happens in the late 40s, or revolutions in Greece and Turkey, and how we interpret that. So this Truman Doctrine is really important. I'll give you, again, a quote from it. It said in March 1947 that the United States will defend free people and their free institutions at any place, at any point in the world where outside communist aggression threatens the nation's internal stability. So, in a sentence or two, that is, eliminating George Washington's idea about, stay out of the rest of the world, don't be concerned with that, right? We say that we have to be concerned with that according to Truman's own doctrine, right? That a failure to contain communism abroad is dangerous. It's almost a dereliction of duty. It's neglectful. It's irresponsible from this perspective, that you have to contain or quarantine. Right? These are terms we're very familiar with now in this context of an epidemic, but they were terms used in the 50s in terms of politics, containing communism, and in terms of economics, right, containing communism. So this notion of containment, right, we did look at communism essentially as a disease that had to be quarantined, that had to be contained. So about the same time Truman lays out this doctrine, a guy named George Kennan writes an article, right? George Kennan, Kennan, writes an article under a pseudonym, right? Remember, this is the 40s and 50s, and this is the Cold War, where, spy stories and novels are, all the thing. He literally writes this under the pseudonym Mr. X, right, in Foreign Affairs Quarterly. He doesn't put his name on it initially. He makes this, he makes the following 3 points in this article under the pseudonym Mr. X. Number one, Kennan writes, the history of Russia has been one of hostile neighbors, and a constant fear of attack. So think about coming out of the World War II era with tens of millions of Russians lost, right? Even Kennan is going to say that is going to have an impact. Right? That's going to have an impact on their worldview. Perhaps that made them insecure, if they weren't already, right, about foreign aggression. If we think back to World War I and the point I made before about our allies and the United States actually sending in troops into Russia, Russia feels like we are not their friend, despite the fact we've just closed ranks and closed shoulders and defeated Adolf Hitler together, right? They feel like, maybe the Germans weren't the only imperialists. And we feel like maybe the Germans weren't the only imperialists to be concerned with. So both sides are concerned. So I think it's interesting that the first point he makes there is Russia has a history of hostile neighbors, a constant fear of attack. They feel like in a few years, Germany might be back. Germany might invade again. And so they're going to do things to try to create a buffer zone, right? Try to create friendly states. Now, from our perspective, them taking over, states, especially by force, is unacceptable. From their perspective, it's necessary. And so I think this is something that perhaps could not have been avoided if you think about it in those terms. So point number one was that kind of Russian insecurity. Point number two, the U.S. has a duty to confront Soviet aggression. So Kennan says, look, they're going to take over stuff. We have to oppose that. He says we should oppose it with, quote, unalterable counterforce. Unalterable counterforce. Well, what does that mean? In 1947, Perhaps that means all of the possible weapons at our disposal. Perhaps that means atomic bombs. Point number 3, the U.S. must maintain a policy of long-term containment. Right? Long-term containment of Soviet aggression. So again, that term containment. We're going to start to see a number of terms that seem to mean the same thing or similar things. Quarantine, containment. We'll talk about domino theories and other things here in a moment. Now, some will criticize Kennan for this, right? Some critics pointed out that it's difficult to determine when containment is required. When do you do that? Do you fight everywhere all the time? Will that not lead to perpetual warfare? Again, think about these questions that foreign policy advisors still study to try to figure out things like a war on terror, right? The current president is trying to figure out, do you pull troops, just decided to pull troops out of Afghanistan. It's been 20 years. Others say that's a bad decision because it's going to lead to instability. But then others say, well, it has to end sometimes. Right? These are still lingering questions that some will parallel or try to parallel. You can decide for yourself whether you think it's a good parallel. The Cold War and the War on Terror, two non-traditional conflicts that are not often just between two nations, right? That are often ideological, right? A battle of ideas as much as anything else. So this is a valuable period, I think, if we think about it in that way. So this policy of containment, right, will require the U.S. to react to Soviet initiatives. It will require us to not be isolationist. It will require us to make a response each individual time, perhaps, when we see aggression. It also, though, gives the president a lot more power. Right? It gives the president more power than perhaps we're comfortable with, because it might require a rapid response. Think about the fact that we haven't declared war in a long time. We don't declare it in Vietnam. Right? It's a conflict, not technically a war, which allows the president a lot more power in terms of making certain decisions. Korean conflict, right? So some say maybe this has an impact on our government. Maybe it has an impact on separation of powers and such. So this policy gives the president much greater military power. In addition, we talked about much greater military spending. So we're perhaps seeing the beginning of this military-industrial complex that is a term that actually President Eisenhower coins. We'll talk about that in a second. So you need to be able to respond quickly, and maybe this is a necessity, but some say maybe it has some red flags too. President doesn't have the luxury of waiting for Congress sometimes, and so that means making kind of unilateral decisions without congressional approval. What does that mean about the power of Congress? Does it diminish the power of that particular check and balance? Remember that after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, President Roosevelt appeared before Congress, right, to request a declaration of war. So even after that physical attack, right, because the context of the time was what it was, Roosevelt has to ask for a declaration of war in 1941. But since the Truman Doctrine, many U.S. military actions, including Korea, Vietnam, right, Somalia, will be undertaken under presidential order instead. Some say this is good because it provides greater flexibility. Some say maybe it's bad because it's kind of a unilateral thing. They mentioned some of that in the video we watched. They mentioned some of the other aspects happening in Europe and the impact of this. We didn't really get a chance to talk about that. So things like the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift become kind of early test cases of post-World War II Cold War activity. Again, we are actively opposed to the spread of Soviet-style communism, and so whenever we see it, it's liable to provoke a reaction. Right? The first plan that put this into place on a large scale was the Economic Recovery Plan of 1947, also known as the Marshall Plan, right? The Marshall Plan. In a commencement speech at Harvard University in 1947, June 5th, 1947, George Marshall, a former general, right, and now Truman's Secretary of State, will propose that the nation make a huge economic commitment to rebuild war-torn Europe. Remember, this is the same George Marshall that Senator McCarthy will attack, right? And so what he say, his quote was that Marshall had been hoodwinked, right? That he had been confused, and that communists were taking advantage of this. But Marshall and others believe that our economy, that capitalism itself, can be used to win this Cold War. And so he says we need to rebuild Europe. Why? Europe is not the United States. Well, think about our lessons from World War I. Right? Think about what happens after the destruction of Europe in World War I. This power vacuum that allows someone like an Adolf Hitler to emerge. Right? This power vacuum that allows someone like a Mussolini and fascists to emerge. So the idea is, don't let that happen again. Use our economy to reinvigorate Europe and Japan as well. Some of you may know that after dropping those atomic bombs, right, we will invest in the Japanese economy, right, to sort of set them up as a counterpoint to China, especially after 1949 when China, quote unquote, goes communist or falls to the communist, quote unquote. So our economy can be a weapon in this war, some might say. So Marshall's plan is to restore Europe, right, to the confidence, restore the confidence of the European people, as he said, set them up for a prosperous economic future. He believed that our economy could be perhaps our greatest weapon, maybe even more powerful than an atomic bomb, which eventually other nations will get, and they do. By 49, the Soviet Union and China may have access to such weaponry. Marshall also believed that economic stability would translate into political stability. And maybe you can't have political stability without economic stability. Again, think about current conditions and how the downturn in the economy can cause disruptions in society at large, disruptions in the political system itself. You can look at, the last year or so and make some analysis about that. Between 1948 and 1951, the United States sent $13 billion in aid to Western Europe. West Germany benefited the most from the plan. West Germany in particular becomes kind of a test case. Think Berlin airlift, right? It becomes almost a battlefield between the U.S. and the Soviet Union for supremacy. Between 1947 and 1951, period historians refer to as the quote-unquote German miracle. West Germany's economic output increases over 300%. 300%. So from destruction to an increase in 300% in a 4-year period, it does seem like an economic miracle in a way. So as the U.S. invests heavily in Western Europe, it also struggles with the Soviet Union for influence in Eastern Europe. We start to feel like the West can be kind of our buffer zone, and the Soviet Union starts to feel like the East is under their control, like it's their backyard, essentially. This becomes evident in 48 with the Berlin airlift, right, in the country as a whole. In the video, I think you saw some examples of this airlift that I think say more than just statistics, right? You saw how, for instance, once the blockade of Berlin is in place, it becomes almost a cultural battle on top of a political one, right? One of the examples they showed were former, Air Force pilots flying missions again in Europe, right? Immediately turning back and flying missions, but they're not dropping bombs, right? The one pilot is dropping chocolate bars, dropping candy bars to German children. In many ways, the Cold War becomes a battle for hearts and minds. Which side are you going to ally with, right? Which side do you think has the superior system, superior economy? Russia feels like they need to keep us out. The Soviet Union, I should say, feels like they need to keep us out, and we feel like we need to keep them out. So that example of the airlift and the parachuting of chocolate bars always stands out to me as a really good example. Berlin is located inside the Soviet-occupied zone. Truman knows he can't necessarily invade via army, but he can fly over, right? He can use this technology in order to achieve the same ends, to bring supplies to the people that have been cut off essentially by this: medical supplies, food supplies, and even chocolate bars, clothing. Eventually, the Soviets kind of realize they've lost and lift the blockade, but we will see other revolutions, many of them sponsored by the Soviet Union, right, in Eastern Bloc countries, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, even Russian troops on the ground, people losing their life, literally, in the process of this. In response, in April 1949, 12 nations in Western Europe and North America will sign the North Atlantic Treaty, forming NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949. The goal of NATO is to coordinate the defense of Western Europe, right? It's designed to be a formidable opponent to Soviet aggression and expansion. The idea is an attack on any one of its nations will be an attack on all. Kind of similar to what we saw in World War I with the idea, Wilson's idea in particular, of a League of Nations. You attack one nation, if it's a part of this league, all other nations will come to its defense, right? The idea is that that's supposed to stop attacks, but what it immediately leads to is formation of a counter organization on the Soviet side. So instead of making things more secure, perhaps it makes things less secure, some might say. So primary support militarily and financially for NATO will come from the U.S., right? We are the superpower, and we will take this very seriously. On top of Europe, we've seen how significant Asia is to this conversation, in particular the role of China. Japan has been removed as an opponent at this point and actually becomes a strong ally against China. So think about how other parts of the world were at war as well. That's why when we talk about the chronology of World War II, we have to think about when we are dealing with, right? China is aggressive in the 30s, 6, 7, 8, 10 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor in Asia itself. So events in these other parts of the world, particularly China, will come to our attention. Right, there's this ongoing civil war between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. Eventually it will be won by Mao and the communist forces in 1949. The nationalists will set up shop in Taiwan and establish the Republic of China. Mao will proclaim the People's Republic of China on the mainland, right? And so this civil war obviously is read in terms of the Cold War, and we feel like this is the fall of China to the communists, and especially with its massive population, this is seen as very significant, very significant. We will recognize the nationalist government because politically we were much more aligned with them. Right? All of this forces government officials here at home to react, and you can decide if you feel like their reaction is an overreaction or if it's a necessary reaction. What we're going to see is a full review of American foreign policy in this period, right? A full review. We talked about last time how something like McCarthyism will run wild here, in part because of the tremendous fear, right? But even in government, many will rethink their reactions. Federal government will create the National Security Council in 1947, and in 1950 the council draws up a new policy statement, right? A new kind of game plan, I guess, called NSC 68. The term here, NSC 68. NSC 68 is a statement that views the conflict between East and West as inevitable. The idea is this conflict is inevitable. It is coming. Who's going to be the best prepared for it? So it sets this agenda moving forward. Part of that said that any conflict will not just affect the United States, but all of civilization. Remember now, we're in an era of nuclear weapons. Right? We're in an era of capabilities that we've never seen before, especially after the dropping of just 2 bombs in Japan. Right? You can see the lingering effects. You can see the immediate effects, hundreds of thousands killed. Right? This is a whole different animal. from traditional warfare and sending in tanks and ships and bombs. And once the other side, quote unquote, gets the bomb as well, right, it changes tactical warfare. Perhaps mutually assured destruction is already enabled, right? Perhaps we have the ability to destroy ourselves as a human species, some might argue. So NSC 68 is drawn up, and it's going to be the game plan moving forward. It advocated an increase in defense spending, as we mentioned at the beginning, right? This idea of defense spending as a weapon. We should increase our defense spending according to NSC 68. At the time, we were spending 5% of the federal budget on defense. 5%. That will change to 20%. And so that quadruples. We also will begin an increase in foreign aid. Right, so not just spending money here at home, but spending money abroad. So NSC will remain a secret document for about 20 years, but it really kind of dictates our policy moving forward. So spending shifts. Now, some are going to argue, just to fast forward, some argues that this works. Some argues that we win the Cold War because we were able to outspend the Soviet Union and that the Soviets are unable to keep up. Right? They're not going to be able to for decades upon decades upon decades, construct nuclear arsenals at the same level as us, and take care of domestic spending. Right? They're not going to be able to do both, and it ultimately will lead to an economic collapse. Right? Not to give away the ending, but that's the argument. So think about this in that terms, and think about whether you agree with that perspective. So domestic affairs, right? Our foreign policy has a tremendous impact on the home front, on domestic affairs. It influences this kind of second Red Scare. It influences the rise of McCarthyism, as we discussed. Other factors will also shape the home front during this period, as we'll see. Think about the 1950s. Think about it even in popular culture. Television shows like Leave It to Beaver, and what we were portraying as the American dream, despite being so fearful, is interesting from a psychological perspective. Right, features of the 1950s include the Cold War, but also includes the kind of rising income, affluence, growth of the middle class that we see portrayed in popular culture and in reality. Many older Americans had grown tired of depression and economic downturns, right? Younger Americans were often apolitical in certain moments, right? Wanting to get away from politics. It all seemed maybe too overwhelming. In a sense, I think we see this in later generations as well, with anti-war movements to the Vietnam War, for instance, later on. Cultural symbols become very important. Right? The 1950s and cultural symbols in the 1950s, I think, help us redefine the American dream. I think about the American dream in this period. Also think about how when that dream seems under attack, how there will be a reaction to that, often a violent reaction. The American dream in the suburbs, right? Job security and a large corporation seemed like the only goal to many. A new car every few years seemed to provide stability and security. Other symbols, cultural symbols, might have political significance as well. Cultural figures like a Marilyn Monroe, right? Television. Some say that this might best be represented, this comfortability, this security, through the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. Right? Dwight D. Eisenhower, this politics of tranquility is often associated with him. And it's interesting that Eisenhower, as a military figure, is going to be the one that starts to really sound a warning for the American people on what he called the military-industrial complex. As we transform from the war machine of World War II that was necessary to win that war back to a peacetime economy, some said that we needed to go from making swords and go back to making domestic things like frisbees, transform back into a peacetime economy. But is that going to be so seamless? Right? In large part, the American dream was supported by expanding investment in the military. We had to do this in order to feel safe. The government will increase military spending after the fall of China, in particular in 1949, after the Korean conflict, which we do not come out on top of. It's a stalemate. It's a draw, essentially. So we will increase spending. Companies that had never been involved in The military came to see it as their best customer, came to see the Department of Defense as their best customer in many cases. I'll give you some statistics. By the mid-1950s, there are over 40,000 defense contractors working for the federal government. 40,000. When you think about expansion of government in World War II and beyond, this is a good example of that. By the 1960s, more than half of all government spending went to the military. So we talked about 5% spending up to 20% to more than half of all federal spending goes to the military by the 1960s. By the 1970s, the Department of Defense has more economic assets, the DoD has more economic assets than the 75 largest corporations in America. Again, think about how this is a transition. This is a tipping point from a kind of separation of military and civilian life to something that looks different. With so many people depending directly on companies connected to the military or supported by the Department of Defense, some social critics will charge that the U.S. has established a permanent wartime economy. So the argument is, okay, in times of in times of national crisis like war, you have to kick it into high gear, right? You have to transition factories to wartime production. You have to allow growth of government, higher taxes in order to win the conflict. But what happens in a Cold War when there isn't one specific conflict, but it's a 40 or 50 year period of such spending or such focus? Is that good for the country or is it bad for the country? So some say that we moved into a permanent wartime economy, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy or a perpetuating prophecy that you have to spend more, but then once you start spending more, you can't stop. And once you start spending more in this area, you have to take it from other areas, which may ultimately hurt the country. This is part of this definition of a military-industrial complex, a kind of marriage between military and civilian life. So, when an economic recession strikes in 1956, President Eisenhower responds by allocating more money to defense. When you start to see this economic downturn, some say, well, how do we get out of the last depression? World War II. Allocate more money to defense, not by supporting public works projects like we saw in the New Deal, building roads and bridges, that kind of stuff. At the end of his second term, Eisenhower himself perhaps has some second thoughts about this. Right? As he leaves office in his farewell address, Eisenhower himself warns Americans that the growing relationship between defense contractors and the federal government poses a threat. Now, I think this has a special significance based on the fact that Eisenhower was a military man, right? He's hugely significant in terms of World War II and his leadership. So the fact that he's the one that says, hey, I think that this military-industrial complex might be a little dangerous, that the government and defense contractors are a little too cozy, a little too close, that this actually may be a threat to the democracy itself, really has to be taken seriously. So in his 1961 farewell address, he coins the term military-industrial complex, and that's where we really get the term, 1961. Now, many Americans will ignore this warning, think about what's happening in the world at the time, and still what's to come. Right? After all, why worry when the economy seems so prosperous? Americans who made up only 6% of the world's population at the time are producing 1/3 of the goods and services in the entire world. Right? So we're 6% of the population, but we're producing 1/3 of everything. During the 1950s, America's gross national product increased more than 50%. Defense spending helps to fuel this economic growth. So some say, look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? Keep doing what you're doing. Home consumption also drives this economic expansion. GIs returning from World War II and Korea are going to be eager to spend money. They're going to be eager to have children. I think about the growth of the population in this era. The boomers. In the 1950s, 29 million new Americans will be born. So basically 30 million new Americans in this decade. The birth rate of the U.S. in this era was comparable to that of India. So we're growing faster than ever before. To meet the consumer demands of this growing population, American industry increases at an amazing rate. We're producing more cars, frisbees, right? Other consumer items, popular culture itself will try to meet the demand. So it becomes this machine. Right? It becomes this productive growth. How do you meet the demand of this? Well, a lot of meeting the demand is going to require new technologies, automation of various types, right? You have in the 50s and 60s technological advances, right? We have electronic machines to help run this industrial growth, automation with things like computers, right? Early computers. Many blue-collar workers, though, start to fear technology. Right? There's a term called technological unemployment that some will refer to in the 19th and 20th centuries, right? This idea that technology can be good, but what happens when technology causes you to lose your job? What happens when you work at the factory with 10,000 others, but suddenly there's a new machine, and now they only need 500 employees, and 9,500 of you have to figure out something else to do. So there's a fear here. There's even a fear of robots taking your jobs, right? Many will perhaps suffer economic anxiety because of that at the same moment that they had just gotten jobs back, at the same moment that they had just replenished their savings. Many white-collar workers also profit from automation. Right? Job growth largely benefits college graduates in this era, not necessarily blue-collar workers or skilled workers, folks working with their hands. New investments in research and development, some of it military-based, some of it outside of the military, will also help many of these college graduates and others. And the middle class itself. Right? College campuses became a center for public life and social life in a way that perhaps they hadn't been before, and some of this fuels this growth of the middle class that we keep talking about. Let me give you a couple of examples to conclude of this growing middle class and popular culture and things we think about, I think, in the 50s and 60s to kind of see some of the impacts of this. During the 50s, the real weekly earnings, right, the actual earnings weekly of factory workers would increase 50%. So imagine getting a 50% raise right now, what that would do for your budgets. Right, the traditional pyramid of income distribution began to look different. Right? You're starting to see a growth of the middle class in between the very wealthy and the very poor. If we consider an annual income of $10,000 to be middle class, right, so imagine at that time, $10,000 is middle class. If that's the standard, in the 1940s, only 9% of people fit that definition. So in the 1940s, only 9% of folks would have been considered middle class. But then, of course, we have World War II and the changes that would come. By 1960, more than 30% of the population were middle class. So in a 20-year period, you go from having 9% to having 30% fit this definition of middle class. The year 1960 is the first time in U.S. history that a majority of high school age people actually graduated from high school. Right, the year 1960 is the first time in our history that a majority of high school aged people actually graduated from high school, aided by things like the GI Bill. College enrollments increase. Owning a home becomes a tangible dream for many, and think about how central home ownership becomes to the American dream in this era, right? The American dream and the middle class aspects of that really change dramatically in this period. The availability of housing. You saw in some of the video clips with, I'm blanking on his name now, Levittown, right? And these construction of housing. Now, some of the problems that are associated with that we'll discuss, but it's tremendous housing. It's growth, and it's a tremendous growth in housing. Low interest mortgages. By 1960, 25% of all housing had been built in the last 10 years. So by 1960, 1 in every 4 houses had been built since 1950. It's a tremendous turnover in literally how we live and where we live. This also manifests itself nationally and internationally. The kitchen debate is always pointed to in this era, right? The kitchen debate occurs between Nixon and Khrushchev, the Soviet leader Khrushchev. A lot of this has to do with culture and politics and the intersection between the two. So we always use this kitchen debate as an example of that. Our economy is at the center of it, and we feel like our economy can give us the advantage in this Cold War. Vice President Richard Nixon, right, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev will be engaged in this debate. In 1959, Moscow will host an international exhibition, and Vice President Nixon goes. Right, despite the fact that we're locked in Cold War with the Soviet Union, he goes and participates in this. The U.S. delegation, led by Nixon, will display a modern, fully stocked American kitchen. Again, think about culture and politics intersecting here. Nixon doesn't come with a bunch of bombs and missiles to show our power, to show our supremacy. He comes with a kitchen, washing machines and our dishwashers and refrigerators, and to show our economic prowess. Consumer goods. At the exhibition, Nixon and Khrushchev literally get into a debate. Right, they're kind of standing in front of these machines, and this debate, almost impromptu debate, pops off, and it becomes the backdrop. Nixon says, "Look at what we have. You can't match this. You can't keep up." All right, so essentially, we're going to outpace you. And it's seen as a tremendous victory in that sense. Is this real victory? We'll have to wait and see. Right? We'll have to wait and see. Is it more fleeting? Is it something that's not tangible? We'll have to see. Right? In the past, we as Americans had longed for necessities, especially coming out of a Great Depression. We wanted things like houses and cars, right, to kind of demonstrate our middle-class identity. You often talk about how the middle class is an imagined community as well. Right? What does it mean to be middle class? Well, it depends. Right? Economists always say it's not just about your income. It's about this middle class identity. Maybe it's about the neighborhood you live in. Maybe it's about your car. Right? It's not just about income. Maybe it's about education level. Maybe it's about what others think of you as being middle class. So much so that 80% or more of Americans identify as middle class despite their income level. This is a powerful dream, some might say. Very powerful. Youth culture in the 50s and 60s would demonstrate a lot of this as well. Think about the ideas you have of the 50s and the 60s. Things like hula hoops, right? Consumer goods like jeans, hula hoops. Like what you wear, almost your uniform in that sense, becomes so culturally significant. Surfboards and skateboards, right, are an important cultural aspect of this time period. One that we will export abroad. Others are kind of watching this and thinking about the American way in these products. Rock and roll music, right, is significant in this era as well. People around the world listening to this, and actually the Soviet Union, as you saw in the video, actively trying to stop the promotion of American culture. Teenagers. We start to measure the teenagers as a group, as kind of a sociological category, and teenagers themselves actually become kind of an imagined community. By 1960, America's teenagers spent $22 billion a year on consumer goods. So teenagers are spenders. Teenagers are putting $22 billion into the economy, buying things for themselves, their group. What is $22 billion? Well, to put it in perspective, $22 billion in 1960 was twice the gross national product of Austria. And so teenagers as a group have more spending power than Austria as a nation at this time. Think about it in that sense. Last but not least, television. Television may be this quintessential example of culture and politics, this quintessential example of culture, the ability to export the American dream abroad through television. All of these things, I think, come together in the kind of television revolution of this era. Some say it's the biggest consumer revolution of all, this growth of the television industry. Now, the technology for TV had existed since at least the 1930s, right? But radio remained really kind of the dominant form of culture early on. It takes a while for TV to tip. It takes a while for it to tip, despite the fact that the technology had existed since the 30s. American companies did not mass produce TVs until after World War II. Once that conflict ends, we kind of turn our attention in a sense. So, for example, in 1946, the year after the war, 1946, there were 17,000 televisions in the entire country. 17,000 TVs in the country in 1946, mostly in the East Coast. By 1949, however, Americans were purchasing 250,000 televisions, 250,000 every month. So we go from having 17,000 in the entire country in 1946 to buying 250,000 new TVs every month 3 years later. By 1953, two-thirds of American homes had at least one TV. So by 53, something is definitely tipped. Right? Two-thirds of American homes have at least one TV. Often, families would gather around it, especially in the evening for the evening news or what have you. We'll come back to this when we think about other figures from the 50s. Think about, say, Martin Luther King appearing on television, using that as a vehicle for a civil rights movement. So by 53, two-thirds of American homes have at least one TV. TV is going to have a lasting cultural influence. It influences political ad campaigns. People start to look at using TV to win elections. So literally the intersection of culture and politics. For example, the presidential election in 1952. This is the first time that a candidate for president made use of television. Television advertising, I should say. Excuse me. Eisenhower, right? Eisenhower uses 15 and 30-second commercials produced by an ad agency, right? And he wins. 1960 is often referred to as the use of television in perhaps the most significant sense, right? In 1960, in that presidential campaign, TV becomes central, right, to the campaign itself. And I think in many ways they realized that TV is essential to Americans by 1960. Many observers blame Nixon's loss to John F. Kennedy on his poor appearance on television. They say he just didn't look right on TV, according to many. During the debates in particular, many were turned off. Right? JFK, they said, looked cool, collected, and presidential. Richard Nixon, according to one observer, quote, resembled a sinister chipmunk. That's what they said. I didn't say it. That's what they said. So literally, how he looked seemed to turn people. And think about, even to this day, how television is an important vehicle for the presidency, achieving it and maintaining it. So the growing impact of TV, the rise of youth culture, is tremendous. Many social critics start to raise red flags about this, perhaps. Right? Some say that we're becoming too homogenous. We're ignoring our diversity in a sense. We're too conformist. Talked about some of the pressures to conformity last time. By 1960, about 30% of Americans, or 55 million of us out of 180 million, live in suburbs. Right? So sort of suburban culture is very important. There are these stereotypical images of suburbia created in this period. Some say it's too conformist. Some say if you stand out, you don't fit in. You can't really flourish there. You can't stay there. Think about Levittown, right? Levittown houses, housewives raising children at home, husbands struggling their way up the corporate ladder. That at least was the narrative that most Americans, would carry. Critics believe that the growth of non-denominational churches indicated that religion itself was becoming a thing of the past in American culture. Think about how politics and culture intersect, even as we conclude. One example we often look at is the fact that it's in the 50s that Congress adds the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. That was not there before the 50s. That was not there before the Cold War. So even after Congress adds "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and "in God we trust" to the nation's currency, right, in order to sort of set ourselves apart from what we consider to be um, the atheism of communist Russia, right? We wanted to sort of distance ourselves from that. Some say, despite that, true spirituality seemed to be disappearing from our culture. If all these claims for conformity, cultural conformity, are true, then there's no perfect politician for this era, no more perfect politician for this era than Dwight Eisenhower. He seemed to kind of embody what many people were looking for. Eisenhower would practice what he called and what others called the politics of tranquility, right, calm. He saw himself more as kind of an executive president, despite the fact that he had this military background, was unimpeachable in that sense. Right, his style is different from, say, the social activism of a Roosevelt or a Truman. He saw himself differently. But as Americans come out of the 50s and into the 60s, we're going to see some shifts in that era. Think about, say, an Eisenhower in 52 to Kennedy in 1960, and how those two figures seem quite different from one another. Kennedy, some argue, will usher in a new era of social activism, or at least help. He's also going to see tremendous cultural unrest until he himself will be removed from the scene in 1963. So we'll talk about this blending of the 50s and 60s a bit more next time. We'll start to look at the complications of the 60s. I'll leave it at that, even as we continue to look at the Cold War. The Cold War does not end in 1959, right? It does not end. It's going to continue through the 60s, and in fact, I would argue we can't understand the 60s without understanding the lingering significance of the Cold War in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s as well. So next time what we'll do is we'll start to look at the subsequent chapter, particularly issues around civil rights, right? The particular questioning of the American dream, that is, civil rights in that sense.